thank you all for coming and welcome. I'm Alan Townsend, here representing the Townsend Center for the Humanities, and this is this year's Una's Gift Endowed Lecture. Allow me to tell you about Una Smith first, through the words of her husband, Edward Hunter Ross. Some of you know this story. Una Smith was born on the 26th of May, 1889, in Alexandria, Dakota Territory. She attributed her name, pronounced Una, to her father's admiration for Latin authors. I have to say I don't get this illusion, and perhaps to an expectation unrealized that others would follow. On his becoming judge of South Dakota's 4th Judicial Circuit, Frank B. Smith moved to Mitchell with his wife Lou Ella Denning and 6-year-old Una. After gaining her bachelor's degree in 1911 and her master's in 1913, both at Berkeley, she worked in a San Francisco settlement house for a year. This was followed by teaching history in South Dakota and Arizona. Despots, arrogant lords, and wicked ladies of fact and fiction always had higher place in her affections than reforming zealots and meek yielders to convention. Those are not my words. Those are the words of her husband when he wrote this bequest. She viewed with boredom, amusement, or hostility almost any self-dedicated group. Women's clubs, religious sects, Native Sons of California, labor unions, civil rights organizations, and many others. Occasional groups were wittily accepted. For example, Presbyterians, quote, because they will always keep God in his place, unquote. Una considered herself a poor teacher, probably with justice in view of her impatience with the reluctant learners and the stupid. Her real talent lay in directing plays. Gradual loss of hearing forced her out of teaching and brought years when real poverty nearly overwhelmed her. This strengthened her loneliness, her independence of thought, and her conviction that each of us should use our minds to form our own judgments. For her, stupidity was almost equaled as a sin by self-delusion and by the lazy, uncritical acceptance of ready-made standards and morals. She believed in an aristocracy of merit rather than of birth or occupation, according run-of-the-mill dukes and doctors of philosophy a scorn equal to her esteem for an expert seamstress or housewife or butcher. Nevertheless, she considered maintenance, even by the unworthy, of privilege with its attendant color, ceremony, and pageantry far less criminal than indiscriminate destruction by a hate-filled proletariat. I don't know why I look at you. True pomp delighted her. True pomp delighted her. Pomposity would make her face glow and sparkle with suppressed laughter. Una loved brightness, tidiness, order, grace, and delicacy without losing her sense of the fundamental values of courage, strength, and perseverance. Our Una lecture today is Jane Taylor. Introducing her will be Catherine Cole, Chair of Theater, Dance, and Performance here at Berkeley, and author most recently of Performing South Africa's Truth Commission, Stages of Transition. Her work Catherine's work, bears down equally intensely on the aesthetic and the tragic dimensions of our performing lives. Speaking personally, I would add that she's the rare human being one feels lucky to know and feels replenished to be around. As for Jane Taylor, let me just say this. I've come to know her here in the past 2 weeks as a luminous personality, from whom there seem to emit showers of energy and joy. I also know that she grew up on a duck and flower farm, and that she earned some of her keep in university through poker, and not always of the most honest sort.
The first time I met Jane Taylor was in spring of 1992. I recall sitting at a picnic table outside the Student Union at Northwestern University, where we were both graduate students at the time. We had been introduced by a mutual friend, part of a small yet powerful cadre of South African academics who had infiltrated the campus. It didn't take me long to discover that this group at Northwestern was convening the most interesting conversations, igniting in the pastoral Evanston suburb a riveting sense of political urgency. Their home country, you see, was in the midst of a revolution, a massive transformation, the outcome of which was entirely uncertain. Nelson Mandela's release from 27 years of imprisonment in 1990 was a hopeful sign. However, the years between his liberation and the first democratic elections 4 years later were among the most violent in South African history. What many people don't realize when they talk about South Africa's so-called peaceful transition from apartheid is that more people died during these few short years than during all the previous decades of apartheid rule. The winds whipping Jane and I that day in Evanston didn't just come from Lake Michigan. They had started decades earlier on the African continent. Evidence that the growth of national consciousness on the continent was becoming a political fact. While it happened throughout the continent, starting in 1960, by 1992, the winds of South Africa's political consciousness had built to gale force velocity, with forces of creation and destruction vying for supremacy. The question of the country's future very much hung in the balance. Whether South Africa has been blessed with an extraordinarily high concentration of brilliant lawyers, artists, ministers, scholars, and leaders, or whether it is the crucible of the country's conditions that forged such remarkable individuals, we cannot say for sure. But we can say that the world has been tremendously enriched by the efflorescence of so many brilliant minds and admirable souls from this beloved country. Jane Taylor is one of those who has been at the forefront of South Africa's provocative thinking. She has written plays and novels, curated exhibitions, and convened scholarly conversations that have served as key nodal points in the country's transition from apartheid to a negotiated settlement, to a new dispensation, a democracy as full of utopian dreams as dystopian nightmares from its past. In such a political climate, the work of intellectual critique and public scholarship becomes all the more important. In this, Jane Taylor's work shines brightly. In 1987, Jane Taylor and David Bunn co-edited the volume From South Africa with University of Chicago Press. And in 1996, she designed and curated Fault Lines, a series of cultural responses to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that followed the end of apartheid. As part of this program, she wrote the play text Ubu and the Truth Commission for South African artist and director William Kentridge and the Handspring Puppet Company. The play has just been revived and was performed at the Edinburgh Festival in 2014. We are extremely fortunate that Cal Performances is hosting a U.S. appearance of this production May 1st to 3rd. I must warn you that tickets are going fast. An additional Sunday evening performance has been added, so you'll want to log on and buy your tickets immediately. There's also an all-day symposium on May 2nd in Wheeler Hall called Impossible Machines, Politics, Puppets, and Truth Commissions. In 2000, Jane Taylor wrote the libretto for a new opera for William Kentridge, The Confessions of Zeno, a work that was performed at the Lincoln Center in New York, as well as the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. She has published 2 novels of Wild Dogs, which won the prestigious Olive Schreiner Prize for New Fiction in South Africa, and The Transplant Men, a work of fiction that is grounded in the first heart transplant, an event that took place in South Africa. In 2009, she edited a book called On the Handspring Puppet Company, which is a handsome study of this celebrated performance company from South Africa. She also serves on the board of advisors of this company and has served on the board of advisors also for Documenta in Kassel. She just completed a monograph on the artist William Kentridge that is forthcoming with the University of Chicago Press, and she is currently writing on the history and theory of sincerity in the early modern era in the West, and I believe her talk today may give us glimpses of this important forthcoming work. In 2013, Jane Taylor was appointed as the Wole Soyinka Chair of the Theater and Drama at the University of Leeds. From 2000 to 2009, she held the Sky Chair of Dramatic Art at the University of Witwatersrand. We are extremely privileged to have Jane Taylor in residence at the University of California, Berkeley in the month of April as the visiting UNA's lecturer at the Townsend Center for the Humanities. I want to extend a special appreciation to Alan Tansman and the Townsend Center board and staff for welcoming Jane Taylor so warmly. On a personal note, I would like to thank Jane for welcoming me to South Africa. When we first met in 1992, I had no idea I would go on to conduct research in South Africa, and specifically on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a subject that has occupied so much of your own imaginative energies. I consider my work in South Africa a calling, and I believe our first meeting on that blustery Michigan lakeside in 1992 to be a pivotal moment in my own calling to your country, a place of such hope and promise, such violence and anguish, and such abundant inspiration to the world. Thank you for your intellectual companionship, generosity, and imagination over all these years. And thank you for coming to be with us and think with us here in Berkeley this spring. Will you please join me in welcoming Townsend Center's 2014 UNA's lecturer, Jane Taylor.
That's kind of scandalously wonderful and generous. And it does feel extraordinarily special in distinctive ways to be here. My talk is slightly too long, so I don't want to take too much time, but I do want to express my very profound thanks to Catherine for having engineered a remarkable generosity to facilitate my coming here, to set in place programs where we can be talking to one another, and to somehow compel the universe to get Ubu and the Truth Commission to be happening at Caryl performances at the same time. So that's, you know, a very special exchange of gifts, so thank you so much. And I also want very much to thank the Townsend Center, Alan Tansman, who has been an outrageously companionable fellow who has got me to confess already about my nasty habits. The other members of the community at the center, Teresa Stoikov, John Paulus, Colleen Barrasso, and Diane Soper have all been inordinately generous. And I'm also delighted at my students in the seminar. That's a very special thing for the university to conjure up for one to have minds of distinction to engage with for a month. So that's all kind of pretty wonderful. Okay, so as Catherine was saying, I have for some while been thinking about a history and theory of the performance of sincerity. Surely sincerity, in its assertion of itself as a natural attitude, resists any implication that it has a history. And so the theory of sincerity resides precisely in locating its history, thereby demonstrating it to be an artful artlessness. This paper strays pretty broad and wide, ranging from the early modern era to recent South Africa. Just so that you're aware of which pole with which we'll begin, I set up my paper with a brief glimpse at the art of rhetoric in the 17th century. I also hope to give some history of an idea for the performances of Ubu and the Truth Commission that will be taking place at Berkeley at the start of May. So let's look at the first sentence provided on the handout. We see that all men naturally are able in some sort to accuse and excuse. No surprise that this dark assessment comes from Hobbes in the opening words of his translation of Aristotle, which is known as A Brief of the Art of Rhetoric. Of course, that balancing of opposites, accuse and excuse, is itself a rhetorical trick. If we place this fragment in the context of the sentences in which it is embedded, it binds its legal implications to what might be considered a theory of acting. And here we go to the second fragment. We see that all men naturally are able in some sort to accuse and excuse, some by chance and some by method. This method may be discovered, and to discover method is all one with teaching and art. Hobbes is not, I think, discussing method acting, but he is, I think, discussing acting, at least in part. There is much profound recent scholarship on Hobbes that is textually oriented, concerned with logos because of the literary bias of the archive. I am today going to focus on two other aspects of rhetoric identified by Aristotle, the meanings arising from questions of performance and of character. I'll be thinking about these modes and their implications for the law. Hobbes's opening yokes the two seemingly incompatible terms, chance and method, to the third term, naturally. He seems to imply that through observing nature, we can identify a method which apes it, thereby grounding a mimetic art that can itself be natural. He proceeds then to discuss inartificial and artificial proofs in law. Inartificial proofs are self-evident and require no persuasion. Artificial proofs, by contrast, are those that lack intrinsic persuasive power and so lean on the skills of rhetoric, with the arts of language and performance embellishing the claim. What strikes me is that in this pair of terms, Hobbes uses inartificial and artificial proofs, And it is the negated term, inartificial, with its negative prefix, that carries what we might consider the positive value, while the positive term, artificial, not grammatically negatively inflected, is the term with negative valency. Linguistically, we are in a world of inversions. I am no Hobbes scholar, and I understand that I am on thin ice indeed, and know that I open myself to vulnerabilities with some distinguished Hobbes thinkers in this Berkeley community. But these permutations open up a conversation of ongoing interest to me. Because while Hobbes's comments are explicitly about the law and rhetoric, I am considering the significance of his thought for the law and rhetoric's putative other, sincerity. Is sincerity one of rhetoric's artificial proofs? Sincerity would assert not. Sincerity, as I have suggested elsewhere, ceases to exist wherever it names itself. It's a value in which it cannot itself trade. Anyone who attests to their sincerity drives sincerity from the room. We understand that Hamlet is on slippery ground when he feels compelled to insist, "I have that within which passeth show." Questions about performance and legal process have engaged me since the 1990s, when as a South African scholar and writer, I observed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Commission was a quasi-legal instrument established to provide a forum for public hearings about human rights violations. Amnesty applications were, in these processes, integral to political transformation. The Commission has variously been described as a political theatre, very notably here at Berkeley in the work of scholar Catherine Cole. This theatrical analogy is not to demean the work of the Commission, but rather to remind us of the potent place of theatre. Seeking to find intellectual precedents for what I was observing, I began to consider the meanings generated around the Reformation in Europe. That might strike one as an unlikely pairing, but the two radically different contexts, South Africa in the 1990s and Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, make available modes of inquiry not so readily evident otherwise. Here, something like Verfremdung, the making strange, becomes operative, as the discordant contexts make visible those elements normally submerged through familiarization and naturalization. So there is something structural in that analogy that I'm drawing between the two domains. At the same time, there is something specific about the content of that comparison, because the genius of the Commission, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, had been trained in the UK and was spiritual head of the Anglican Church, a body that found its purpose through an accommodationist logic that had made nation formation possible through reconciling Puritan and Catholic extremes. I'll return to the South African case later, but let me dwell now on the early modern era for what it reveals about the emergence of the discourse of the sincere. During the Reformation, every adult in Europe had to come to terms with conversion. One either converted or decided not to. None was indifferent. Many households would have held individuals who had made different decisions. The demands imposed on the self of being able to produce a persuasive performance of religious identity, as well as a convincing dissembling, must have been very compelling indeed. Does this doubling participate in establishing the modes through which it becomes possible for the good Protestant subject to mobilize a performance that would be taken as no performance at all? And is this the birth of acting traditions that will culminate in the celebrated actor David Garrick and his particular form of naturalized inwardness? This is the genius of sincerity. It is inhabited as if arising spontaneously from within, with no regard for external compulsion. As connoisseurs of feeling, we have learned how to present and how to receive such images of presentation. I'm suggesting then that the question of sincerity in the early modern era is implicit inside any consideration of conversion. In the modern imagination, conversion has come to signify as a largely individual choice. We have in mind, many of us, the Pauline instance on the road to Damascus as exemplary. An elected individual hears the voice of God. It would be difficult to hear the voice of God on the road to Damascus today. I momentarily examined one or two websites while preparing this paper and was shown in such vivid terms the scale of the misery and grief inside the military assaults ongoing. The earliest recorded use of sincere in English that I can locate is in the Tower of London in 1533, a forensic context par excellence. The setting should make us pause when we imagine how the talk of sincerity might arise. In order to evoke that setting most fitly, here again is Hobbes, once more from the art of rhetoric, but now considering the status of utterances extracted under torture. He says, "For the torture, if the one giving of it make for us, we must say that 'tis the only testimony that is certain. But if it make for the adversary, we may say that men enforced by torture speak as well that which is false as that which is true. That they who can endure conceal the truth, and they who cannot say that which is false to be delivered from pain." If it were not in bad taste, one might characterize the prose here as tortured. Some of this might well result from the practice of translation and an endeavor to capture or to manage Aristotle's intended meaning. But some of its fraughtness seems to arise from the subject matter itself, as if torture summons up occlusion, disguise, ambiguity. It's remarkable that a text dedicated to the exploration of rhetoric's power is in this key moment overcome by clumsy ineptitude. The word sincere deployed in the Tower arises between, on one hand, John Frith, Puritan activist, who has been captured while trying to return to Europe to work with Tyndale on publishing an English Bible. The other figure in the dialogue is Thomas More, Henry VIII's Chancellor, a man who ended up as the hound of the Pope and persecutor of Protestants. Frith ultimately is burned at the stake for betraying Rome. A decade later, More would be headed for trying to defend it. Before he died, Frith managed to smuggle out of the Tower a text he had written in response to More's Articles of Faith. This is the document that carries that incendiary device, the sincere. It seems somewhat uncanny now to be thinking about young men in England in the 16th century who are converts fleeing that country in order to join a cohort of religious zealots abroad. The analogy is, of course, inadequate to our situation, though curiously resonant. Still, all of Europe is, in the 16th century, infected with the contagion of conversion, as young iconoclasts seeking renewal tear down the images that boast of the wealth of a religious hierarchy that has abandoned the interests of the masses. Nothing but an utter renunciation would suffice. Martyrdom, like iconoclasm in the 16th century, is one of the manifestations of the sincere. Thomas More, in a letter to Erasmus from 1533, the same year that he engages with Frith in the Tower, notes, quote, "I considered it my duty to protect the integrity of my reputation. After resigning my office, I waited until the opening of the new term, and so far no one has advanced a complaint against my integrity. Either my life has been so spotless, or at any rate I have been so circumspect that if my rivals oppose my boasting of the one, they are forced to let me boast of the other. As a matter of fact, the king himself has pronounced on this situation at various times, frequently in private and twice in public." Integrity, to a modern sensibility, is associated with the management of a private demeanor, while reputation we generally hold to be the defense of the public being. Here More speaks of the integrity of his reputation. It's worth bearing in mind that Thomas More is here writing a letter, a document that participates in ambiguity, straying as it does between private and public spaces as it circulates. More's contemporary, the historian and brilliantly duplicitous Francesco Guicciardini, makes the following comment in his Ricordi, quote, "The position I have filled under several popes has obliged me for personal reasons to desire their greatness. But for this, I should have loved Martin Luther as myself." We would be ill-advised to take this observation at face value, so to speak. The comment points to a self which is a strangled constellation, borne in upon by the forces of political ambition, supreme omniscience, and personal faith. And the writer is caught between the dual constraints of conscience and compulsion. Questions of sincerity have no bearing here. Rather, it would seem that Guicciardini's cry is that every man must serve at least two masters. Before schism, there was limited room for spiritual connoisseurship or for self. It is in the act of writing here that something like a sense of an autonomous identity begins to flourish, in the moment that such a self becomes doubly captive, addressing internal and external authorities, and thus in a way escaping both while eluding neither. Guicciardini's statement does not inscribe itself as bad faith. He does not covertly wish for the decline of the papacy. Rather, he desires their greatness. His desires have stitched themselves to the inside of the pocket of patronage. His professional obligations are strangely characterized as personal reasons, per el particolare mio. So here there's not a separation of a public self on one hand of the equation and a private self on the other. He desires the greatness of the popes, his professional interest, as his private interest. Looking at these two servants of Rome, More and Guicciardini, we see that it's not helpful to think of either of them as typical or exemplary in this matter. Nonetheless, the comparison suggests that people are thinking of themselves as complex, as composite. Such an idea does not arrive full-grown. Let me make my case through considering Catherine Parr, consort of Henry VIII and his last queen. She is one of the earliest writers in English to use the term sincere and was a significant Puritan thinker. During the dangerous last years of Henry's reign, Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, plotted to destroy her. He was offended by Parr's Lutheran principles and accused her of hoarding prohibited books in attempts to alienate her from the king, whose self-styled Protestantism was of a decidedly more pragmatic and opportunistic sort. At one point, a bill of articles which outlined her heterodox beliefs was drawn up against her, largely on the evidence of her extensive heretical library. The lucky Parr saw the document and strategically submitted herself to Henry, throwing herself upon his mercy. John Fox's recreation of the scene of her voluntary humiliation in his Book of Martyrs is ambiguous because it does the work of reconciling the author's stock misogyny against Parr's sex with his sympathy for her Puritanism. His literary strategy is to resolve these forces through having Parr abuse her own womankind, placing the standard misogynistic rhetoric within her own voice. In Fox's telling of the scene, it is she who berates herself. And I quote, "Your Majesty," quoth she, "doth right well know, neither I myself am ignorant what great imperfection and weakness by our first creation is allotted unto us women, to be ordained and appointed as inferior and subject unto men as our head, from which head all our direction ought to proceed, and that as God made man to his own shape and likeness, whereby he, being endued with more special gifts of perfection, might rather be stirred to the contemplation of heavenly things." Through this act of ostentatious ventriloquism, Fox has Parr submit herself to an absolutist patriarchy that we must imagine would have been at odds with her own convictions. Gardiner then sought to damn her through her association with the Puritan Anne Askew, Parr's friend and intellectual companion. In 1546, when Askew was arrested, she was so violently tortured that she had to be seated when they finally burned her to death. She died without implicating the Queen. Parr's case suggests that political acumen is not necessarily incompatible with piety. Clearly, the Queen recognized the need to position herself in relation to the favor of the king, while perhaps at the same time courting God himself, the one whose absolute authority surpassed even her husband's. Despite this period of critical threat, Parr managed to outlive the king. Her Lamentations of a Sinner was published 2 years after Henry's death. It's a prose narrative document accounting a spiritual journey. Parr's own insistent protestations of sincerity in the text might suggest that the astute woman was interrogating her motives and strategies. She had, after all, lived out her life negotiating her faith within that security which Henry's protection had guaranteed her. His shadow must have been very large within her, even after his death. But she is surely, too, in a dialogue with Cranmer and potential new allies. It's not impossible to imagine that her reiterations of sincerity are at some level pleas also for her husband king, who had engaged in such a lethal dissembling as had precipitated the break with Rome. In her Lamentations, she folds her own plea into Henry's, and she is expressly his advocate rather than her own, despite the fact that he is dead, although there remains a possibility that such passages were written while Henry was yet alive, even though only published after his death. And here I'm going to read the fourth fragment on your handout. But our Moses and most godly, wise governor and king hath delivered us out of the captivity and bondage of Pharaoh. I mean by this Moses, King Henry VIII, my most sovereign, favorable lord and husband, one, if Moses had figured any more than Christ, through ye excellent grace of God, meet to be an other expressed verity of Moses' conquest over Pharaoh. And I mean by this Pharaoh, the Bishop of Rome. What I'm suggesting here is that sincerity emerges in part through the complex negotiation in the shifting terrain between religious integrity and Roman authority, royal prerogative and Protestant ambitions, marital fidelity and personal autonomy. Lamentations of a Sinner is a fascinating meditation that eschews the discourse of hypocrisy in favor of a language of sincerity. Though Parr does invoke the typical language of Matthew 23, this noble lady will be no Pharisee, she says at the start of the piece, and in the closing passages she accuses the Bishop of Rome of all pride, vainglory, ambition, hypocrisy, and feigned holiness. She characterizes her own convictions as sincere 8 times in the brief text. So here we have it again, that anxiety about a split between the outer and the inner self. The rhetoric of sincerity that was emerging across a diffuse but defining terrain is testing and producing modern subjectivity in contradictory ways. On one hand, the sincere self is a solitary creature, inward-looking, self-reflexive. Yet sincerity can be called upon to stage itself in relation to an external authority. The individual subject acquires a vast semiotics of gesture and expressive style from materials as diverse as playtexts and portraits, broadsheets, confessionals, sermons, letters, and conduct books. These technologies somehow both arise from, yet also produce an inner world. When Catherine Parr attests to her own sincerity, she draws on strategies and codes which inhabit and manage her, rather than those she manages. In the end, she is impelled by both inner and outer voices. This is some way from self-fashioning. In other words, it's a fundamentally dialectical production of being for which there is an unresolved contest over internal versus external authority. The apparatus for conjuring up a performance of sincerity is learned through the disciplines of the larger cultural context, which had torture as one of its instruments of persuasion well into the modern era, and, as we know, beyond. Welling's study of the uses of torture as an instrument of the law cites an Italian treatise from 1612, interestingly, the same year in which Thomas Heywood in England was to publish the early acting treatise, An Apology for Actors. And this is what Welling's, this Italian treatise, notes about torture. The mode of administering torture by the use of the rope was invented by the civil law. And this torment of the rope, sometimes called the Queen of Torment, was justly invented for the sake of the public welfare, to the end that crimes might not remain unpunished. It is called a species of evidence substituted to supply the lack of witnesses. Nonetheless, torture is described here as, quote, always a subsidiary remedy to be invoked only when truth cannot be discovered in any other way. Not for ethical reasons, but because, quote, some people have such an incapacity for the endurance of pain that they are more willing to lie than to suffer torments. Others, again, are so obstinate that they are more willing to suffer any torments whatsoever than to confess to the truth. The persuasive art of sincerity takes its authority largely from that set of contradictions. One archive of the ideological trauma of the era resides in the records of the torture and execution of countless pious men and women. Another is evident within the reciprocal discourses of theology and acting through an unlikely semantic term, hypocrite. The hypocrite on the Greek stage is an actor. In 17th century culture, the hypocrite is a dissembler, a whited sepulchre in New Testament terms. I'm not certain what to make of the striking fact that sincere has its antonym in insincere, while hypocrite has no such equivalent form. The opposite of hypocritical is sincere. That's a linguistic puzzle. By the 17th century, hypocrisy and insincerity begin to displace, disrupt, or entail one another. And these terms are used pretty well interchangeably. As, for instance, we see in Thomas Cooper's The Estates of the Hypocrite and Sincere Christian, containing certain lively differences between sincerity and hypocrisy, very necessary for the trial of our estates in grace. The discourse on hypocrisy has a particular kind of usefulness. In the early modern era, its awful power is precisely that it institutes processes of internal regulation and self-censorship, accusing the wayward thinker. In other words, anyone who engages in inquiries or behaviors that are not already sanctioned and authorized stands accused of hypocrisy because their behavior is no longer consonant with their thought. If Foucault's panopticon is the non-discursive formation that gives rise to internal surveillance, then it may well be that the rhetoric against hypocrisy undertakes some of this work at a discursive level. It curbs any tendency to occupy the split between a performance of orthodoxy and the internal probing associated with skepticism by calling for and affirming the correspondence between inner conviction and outer demonstration. We may not stray internally, for that way lies the accusation of hypocrisy. Our minds shackle themselves to orthodoxy. This also casts some new consideration on the pieties of imitation, a spiritual exercise that similarly relies on the reciprocal mimesis between inner and outer arts. Calvin in the 16th century introduced the term Nicodemite to describe those who, under threat, dissembled religious beliefs that conformed to the status quo. The Nicodemite held that God would not reject anyone who disguised their belief through feigned practices as long as the state of their soul remained loyal. This, of course, is tantamount to advocating the pragmatics of hypocrisy. The Hobbesian position, cuius regio, oius religio, whose region, his religion, was effectively the ruling taken at the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 to resolve disputes between Catholics and Lutherans. princes were given the right to determine the religion of territories under their control. And there was a period of grace during which anyone unhappy with the religion of the area in which they found themselves was free to move voluntarily into another principality. The horrors of this resolution are evident to anyone who reads it in the light of history. One can understand the requirement to have a performance of piety available in such circumstances. I'm well aware that there are differences decided between Hobbes and Locke. It's striking, though, to consider the two men on the matter of the representation of conscience. For Hobbes, the self is necessarily always evasive and unavailable to judgment because convictions cannot be tested. Everyone is a natural dissembler. He says in his Behemoth, and this is, on the back of your the handout, as for their actions, there is no doubt all men are guilty enough, if God deals severely with them, to be damned. And for their preaching, they will say, they thought it agreeable to God's revealed will in the Scriptures. If they thought it so, it was not disobedience, but error. And how can any man prove they thought otherwise? Here we have the spectre of Frith and the torture chamber. Locke, by contrast, asserts in his letter concerning toleration, everyone is orthodox to himself. For Locke, we cannot believe what we don't believe. In these matters, we can't dissemble. I have earlier implied a link between the aesthetic practices of performance and the early modern religious attitudes to toleration. By the 18th century, the actor Garrick, who is cited as having initiated a new mode of performance associated with a new kind of interiority, characterizes his performance art in terms of a theological shift. Let me provide a brief sketch that makes the case linking acting methodologies to questions of toleration. The playgoer, Richard Cumberland, recollects the impact of Garrick's art, and I quote, "When after long and eager expectation I first beheld little Garrick, then young and light and alive in every muscle and in every feature, come bounding on the stage, it seemed as if a whole century had been stepped over in the transition of a single scene. Old things were done away, and a new order at once brought forward, bright and luminous and clearly destined to dispel the barbarisms and bigotry of a tasteless age, too long attached to the prejudices of custom and superstitiously devoted to the illusions of imposing declamation." Garrick's apparent psychological realism, as we might term it, was identified by the stutters and starts in his articulation and his animated and complex language of gesture, which seemed to strike the audience as arising from sensibility. It didn't win him universal admiration. He was at times vilified by fellow practitioners from the old dispensation. In particular, his fellow actor Quinn, who characterized Garrick as the new religion. He says, Whitfield was followed for a time, but they will all come to church again. It's striking for a consideration of hypocrisy that a new acting style should be characterized so expressly within a religious rhetoric. Garrick defended himself in a tract in which he feigned to be attacking himself. This was a favorite rhetorical strategy of his, and many of the published assaults against Garrick were put out by himself. That in itself is worth consideration as a strategy of the dissembling performer. Garrick, in a very modern way, understood that there's no such thing as bad publicity. He responded to Quinn using the same religious metaphorics deployed by his antagonist, but he shifted the terms from nonconformist extremism to religious renewal. And this is Garrick's response. Pope Quinn, who damns all churches but his own, complains that heresy corrupts the town, that Whitfield Garrick has misled the age and taints the sound religion of the stage. Schism, he cries, has turned the nation's brain, but eyes will open, and to church again. Thou great infallible, forbear to roar, thy bulls and errors are revered no more. When doctrine meet with general approbation, it is not heresy, but reformation. Okay, so I'm now quickly going to move on to the comparative case by looking at the last decade of the 20th century in South Africa. And I'm considering here the end of the apartheid era, an era in which a racialized political system that deployed pseudoscience and political theology in maintaining a world order that extracted labor power from a degraded and dispossessed indigenous population. I don't know how many of you heard Justice Albie Sachs, who's been here at Berkeley in the past week, giving some fascinating insights into his sense of transition and its meanings. I must make clear that my analogy between South Africa and early modern Europe is not teleological. South Africa is not Europe's past. Rather, I'm aware of the ways in which I interpret the upheaval of modernizing Europe in ways that are inflected by my scrutiny of South Africa in transition. Neither instance provides the model for the other. Still, the TRC produces performances of self such as Hobbes might have scrutinized. So for those of you who are not entirely clear about what the TRC is, 1994 was the year in which South Africa held its first non-racial election, and 2 years later established a series of public hearings into human rights violations under apartheid. Precedents for models of transition were considered from the world arena. The model of a general amnesty was considered, such as had taken place in Latin America, but rejected because the mechanism took no record of actions perpetrated and no sense of accountancy for individuals implicated in violations. There was considerable input from Chile, who also had a kind of confessional process, but their hearings were held in camera. And the important thing about South Africa was that the hearings were held in public. The Commission both failed and succeeded in uneven and unpredictable ways. It could be characterized as a founding theatrical event, a metaphysical tournament of value, and that's to appropriate Arjan Appadurai's formulation, which he's talking about objects and the way that value gets contested. But I think that one has to imagine that battles over value get contested in various different domains other than the ballot box. So in order to open up, finally, the theoretical questions around rupture and conversion, I'm going to look very quickly again at the early modern era with a fragment from Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus, because this was really the place where a lot of my thinking about the sincere began, and that's at the bottom of the first page of your notes. In Titus, the Moor, Aaron, acknowledges his role in a series of crimes, including rape and murder. He's interrogated by Lucius, who asks, "Art thou not sorry for these heinous deeds?" And this is Aaron's shocking response. "Aye, that I had not done 1,000 more. Even now I curse the day, and yet I think few come within the compass of my curse, wherein I did not some notorious ill, as kill a man, or else devise his death, ravish a maid, or plot the way to do it, accuse some innocent, and forswear myself, set deadly enmity between two friends, make poor men's cattle break their necks, set fire on barns and haystacks in the night, and bid the owners quench them with their tears. Oft have I digged up dead men from their graves and set them upright at their dear friend's door, even when their sorrows almost was forgot, and on their skins, as on the bark of trees, have with my knife carved in Roman letters, 'Let not your sorrow die, though I am dead.'" There is something wildly exhilarating in the awful owning of acts which we are allowed to witness. What should one make of Aaron's anti-confession? Are there conceptions for me to draw on that might help me to situate this obdurate soul? Are there terms within which Aaron is legible from the situation of our perspective as modern audience? Aaron's confession is an uncanny equivalent of the reportage covering recent war crimes hearings at the World Court in The Hague. The trial, for example, of Slobodan Milosevic became a scandal for the Western media because of the non-compliance of the prisoner, who recognized neither the legitimacy of the court nor the terms of his indictment. Shakespeare's antagonist, Aaron, doesn't attempt to diminish the hideous facts or the hideous acts for which he is culpable. He doesn't suggest that his crimes were misdemeanors. Rather, he defiantly owns his actions in all of their extremity. Aaron has been interpolated, Althusser's term. He occupies the identity which has been imposed upon him by the other. Judith Butler reimagines Althusser's exemplary scene in ways which usefully dramatize its meaning. And I quote from her, "The theory of interpolation appears to stage a social scene in which a subject is hailed, the subject turns round, and the subject then accepts the terms by which he or she is hailed. This is, no doubt, a scene both punitive and reduced, for the call is made by an officer of the law, and this officer is cast as singular and speaking. The call itself is also figured as a demand to align oneself with the law, a turning around to face the law, to find a face for the law, and an entrance into the language of self-ascription. Here I am, through the appropriation of guilt." Why does subject formation appear to take place only upon the acceptance of guilt, so there is no I who might ascribe a place to itself, who might be announced in speech without first a self-attribution of guilt, a submission to the law through an acceptance of its demands for conformity? What kind of relation already binds these two, so that the subject knows to turn, knows that something is to be gained from such a turn? The turn toward the law is thus a turn against oneself. Aaron allocates himself the position which is allowed to him by the accusation of the Goth. Perhaps he intuits that he cannot fulfill the demands of the law because, as Butler suggests here, such a process requires a submission to the law through an acceptance of its demands for conformity. Aaron is, after all, excluded from conformity because of his blackness. The representation of Aaron is clearly discursive. Aaron is one of Shakespeare's Moors, and although this fact does not result in an absolute flattening of individual character to type, Aaron is nonetheless coded within the racial discourses of Renaissance England. Shakespeare's construction of Aaron seems to draw on an unstable complex of several rhetorics defining ethnicity and identity, each with distinct constellations of meaning. I would suggest that there is a discursive field which casts new light on the figure of Aaron, which has particular relevance for the history of the sincere subject. This speculation is informed by a distinct conjunction of representational puzzles in Titus Andronicus, a play which is itself largely about the crisis of representation. My thinking has been largely determined by a very particular and perhaps unlikely set of early modern discourses, those relating to the converso Jew. In order to make such a case, it's easy enough to cite extra-textual and historical evidence to make the case that Aaron is, in the biblical account, the brother of Moses, or to indicate that the historical Titus was the Roman general responsible for the sacking of Jerusalem and the suppression of the Jewish rebellion in the 1st century, assaults that were to culminate in the siege at Masada. Given this logic, it seems inevitable that any figure named Aaron would be the sworn enemy of Titus. More compelling for my purposes is the evidence internal to the play. When Aaron is held to account for his vile acts, we discover from his speech that, while he does not own his past, he will not renounce it. While it is possible to interpret this as a sign of his obdurate evil, I would suggest that it's possible to read Aaron in relation to changes in European politico-theological reasoning. A profound transformation was taking place with the radical changes brought about by the Reformation. Medieval policies of the expulsion of Jews began to shift to an inducement to conversion at the end of the 16th century. Antonius Reuchlin's vast Hebrew concordance published in 1556, had begun theoretically to indicate that the conversion of the Jews was somehow necessary to God's eternal plan of redemption for Gentiles. As a result, converted Jews were increasingly tolerated and drawn into mainstream European society. Inevitably, conversion destabilizes conceptions of the link between nation and religion. This is evident from the start in the universalist rhetoric of Pauline teaching. After his own conversion, Paul advocates a faith that is available to Jew, Greek, and barbarian alike. The new impulse to assimilation placed the Jewish community in an all but intolerable position, as inevitably their motives for conversion were suspect. Jews, after all, had been banished from England by Edward I in 1290. Those who managed to stay on had done so by concealing their faith, their practices, and their histories. The conversos, or new Christians, as they were often designated, were associated with strategic dissembling, and Jews became synonymous with insincerity. Etienne Balibar's essay, Is There a Neo-Racism?, suggests that under the conditions of late capitalism and globalization, we have generated a neo-racism that returns to the proto-racism of the early modern era. His discussion provides some thoughtful insights on the matter. The racism which prevails in the era of multiculturalism is, Balibar suggests, a racism which does not have the pseudo-biological concept of race as its main driving force. Culture, rather than biology, is increasingly the perceived engine of difference, and in this our attitudes are reminiscent of those prevailing in the early modern era. While the categories of ethnicity and of religion in the Renaissance are clearly not the same as those which we have inherited, the identity of Shakespeare's Arendt nonetheless seems to arise from what I would describe as an emerging somatics of race, which, so to speak, bedevils any possibility of conversion. No one in the play is figured as more conscious of this than Arendt himself. Let us consider his response to the Goth, when he says, the Goth asks him, "What canst thou say all this and never blush?" To which Arendt replies bitterly, "I, like a black dog," as the saying is. Throughout the early modern era, the blush is cited as a natural sign of sincerity. Arising from within to appear on the surface, it cannot dissemble. Like tears, the blush by the 18th century will become an irresistible signifier of sincerity. However, Arendt's dark complexion makes the evidence of a blush illegible. His curt response is an accusation. He blames those whose representational practices fail to take account of him. "As you name me, so I am." Because within dominant discourses, blackness is its own sign, because blackness has been established as a deficit, because common assertion allows him only that consciousness which is identical to his outside blackness, because his inner being has no trace, he boasts of his black deeds. As a result, he confirms what others already knew. Arendt, in the end, has no choice but to be sincere, because his inside is written on the surface of his skin, his mark of blackness. Okay, so I'm just very quickly, for one final fragment, wanting to show you a moment from the Truth and Reconciliation hearings to give you something of the texture of the events, the kind of performance of self that I was watching. There was a figure, Dirk, who in the late 80s had actually broken the story about execution squads in South Africa, and he'd gone into voluntary exile abroad and had approached the ANC with information that he had about these secret hit squads. And there was, in fact, a hearing inside South Africa trying to determine whether his claims were entirely spurious or whether they had any legitimacy whatsoever. And Dirk managed to get a kind of amnesty from South Africa, and then he was one of the first people to apply for general amnesty, or not general amnesty, to apply for a personal amnesty in spite of the killings he'd been implicated in the 80s in South Africa. And the fragment that you're going to see will give you some sense. Each week in South Africa, there was a televisual overview of the hearings and the events of the preceding days from the Truth and Reconciliation hearings. And this is a summative overview TV show.
Of course, Coetzee did not lie. Virtually every word he said 7 years ago, he said again this week. Let's go to the drama of the hearings in Durban.
Dirk Coetzee joined the South African police on 1 April 1917. With hindsight, it is impossible to overlook the irony of the date.
But what you're going to see in this fragment is Dirk Coetzee is interviewed outside of the hearings, in which he talks about his sense of self-revulsion and self-accusation. And then you also see a fragment of him actually inside the hearings in which he's making an amnesty appeal of the hearings.
Past.
It is, up till this day, so humiliating, it evokes so much anger inside me. Why could I've allowed myself into such a mess? Embarrassment, I can't tell you. I don't know what to say, but it's bloody difficult, I can tell you.
His application for amnesty coincided with the anniversary of the date that he left the country in 1989 to tell the whole story for the first time to the media. It was not an easy step to take.
You lose everything that you worked for in your life. Go out of the country, go and face the so-called enemy, tell them you're sorry, and then with your back against the wall, and with the help of the world media, because they say the pen is mightier than the sword, and I firmly believe it up till this day. And try then and fight this mighty apartheid system and mighty security police from outside. I just could not see my way open. Exposing hit squads in South Africa, in a South African court with the South African laws. It was just impossible. And the way they sort of dealt with people like Dirk Coetzee, they made you part of their atrocities. Then once they push you to the side, you're isolated. If you might stand up and speak out inside South Africa, they'll isolate you, make you a scapegoat, as it clearly was proved in 1989 when they said I was a renegade cop, a maverick cop, a guy whose mental equilibrium was upset as a result of my sugar diabetes. So I couldn't see my way open.
The Haddams Commission did not believe his story.
If a judge goes to the extreme where he says in public, and I quote, "How must I believe this crap you're talking?" Close quote. I mean, what chance did I have in South Africa against honorable generals, all church-going generals, elderlies in the church, ministers who's elderlies in the church, and honorable men, against a little...
During his amnesty hearing, Dirk Coetzee hopes to tell his story for the last time, but he will not be able to bury it.
There's one thing that I will have to live till the day I die. It's the corpses that I will have to drag with me to my grave of the people whom I've killed. Remorse, I can assure you, a lot. A hell of a lot.
So I was, always kind of astonished by the affective strangeness of that performance of self, and trying to think it through. It's obviously in part a kind of a theatrical improvisation. He's in a situation of quite profound ontological uncertainty. He's been raised as a Calvinist. He understands what the obligation is on himself to somehow release himself from the burden of his culpability. He's also aware that he's still a legal subject, that he can't implicate himself in a way, even though he's in the process of applying for amnesty. He's now on camera speaking about his own attitude to his behavioral past. So it's a very, very compound and complex self. At some level, he also just can't prove himself to be so psychically incompetent that he can entirely divorce himself from the self that has given rise to himself. You know, that he has to find some instrument for holding together the person who is in this situation now, talking about his embarrassment. And that in itself is a kind of an infantile term. You know, one is embarrassed that the self has betrayed the self. There's a kind of an acrimony which is almost childish in its charge in that scene. So trying to think of the meaning that I was observing here, I came across another really interesting comparative thing, and I'll end with this very, very brief fragment. There's a fascinating study, Tobias Jones's The Dark Heart of Italy, which is a study of the Berlusconi phenomenon. And the book looks at the Slaughter Commission, which was listening to hearings around the left-wing activities between the 60s and the 80s in Italy. And one of the key defendants at those hearings was the journalist and intellectual Adriano Sofri, who had been involved in an accusation of killing a policeman. And he describes his own reflections on his prior political life. He says, "I had to overcome a resistance to fighting an old battleground I had abandoned a long time ago. I couldn't defend myself as I am today, with my more rounded thoughts, my good manners, and my old books. I had to defend the person I was then, sharp-tongued, vituperative, constantly on the move. I was faced with the alternative of confounding time and losing my relationship to my own past." So, you know, that sense then of the kind of how one deals with the crisis of a rupture inside the self when one is experiencing a kind of radical transformational upheaval in the public sphere. So this attempt to understand the relationship between external authority and internal universe, going back to the Reformation and finding in the Reformation there that this discourse around the sincere has been part of the instrument I'm using to try and understand what I'm observing in recent South Africa in relation to kind of historical structures of such rupture. Okay, thanks everyone. Sorry it was longer than it should be. Any questions or comments? Yes.
Put it together. What struck me about him is if you had to take out the sound, I mean, he's got a very nice look on his face. You wouldn't see anything that would show what he's actually talking about. And it's quite shocking.
I know, it really is kind of uncanny. There's almost a rigidity in a kind of sweet-faced smile. And there's obviously, there must be so much managing of anything like an affective charge that is going to allow him to slip through layers of himself. You know, there's that marvelous observation by William James in What is Emotion, in which James says, commonplace sense says that we weep because we are sad. No, we are sad because we weep. And I suspect if he were to allow his facial expression to inhabit anything like the affective universe that he's exploring there, it would be all but impossible for him to navigate the depth of the fall that he would go into. Mm-hmm. So I suspect that part of what one is observing there is a very powerful constraint on the inner world through what he's doing in the outer world. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And then you also don't hear very much in the resonance of his voice. He's like killed off the resonance of his voice. Yeah. It's very interesting. I think that's very, interesting to think. And that was all the richness of what one was dealing with when working with the performances in Ubu and the Truth Commission, is to try and apprehend these strange strategies for managing the psychic universe of the self, particularly when you're working with a puppet, because a puppet is an affective neutrality. You don't have to efface the habitual performance of the
charged human being as you do with an actor. You start from ground zero, and everything that happens in the puppet, you add to it. There's nothing there to start with. So it's a very, very different kind of representational field for performance. Yeah. Yes, Paula?
One of the most incredibly surprising things about the amnesty applications that I learned from your wonderful seminar is that expressions of remorse were not necessary for getting amnesty. And as I was listening to you talk about the importance of the issue, the difficulty of reconciling the internal world and the external world, it would seem to me that that's the one tool that one might have, whether one performs the remorse or not, but the actual feeling of remorse would be the one way to reconcile those two things. And then watching this performance of some mixture, I read the smile as one, similar to what you're saying, but one of profound shame. People do smile when they're ashamed. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that combination of...
No, it is very striking to realize that one could gain amnesty without inhabiting a position of grief for something that one had been implicated in, that you're acknowledging that you did it. And that's, in a way, why I was so interested in Aaron as a figure. What are we learning about that mode of performance? Because, of course, Ong says quite clearly that oral cultures strike one for their agonistic quality, that there's something inside oral cultures that clings to a kind of performative residue of truth. So there's always a kind of a battleground being contested in oral culture. So I was really interested in Aaron as a particular kind of idiom of expressive self. The Latin Americans, in fact, Ariel Dorfman was very explicit, and he said he counseled us not to use the performances of remorse as an instrument of consideration, because he said the moment you ask someone to demonstrate remorse for an event, you are compelling them to produce a performance. And he says right from the ground moment, you are obliging people into unnecessary deception. Precisely because whether you're guilty or not, you cannot assemble a performance appropriate to what you've done. And it was pretty striking to hear Justice Sachs the other evening, who lost an arm and was blinded in one eye in a car bomb attack on him in Mozambique. And he, at the Truth Commission, met with the person who had set the bomb. And he said in that encounter, part of what was significant about it was that the man who did it to him expected to meet with him, expected to be able to have a kind of foundational conversation, but never said sorry to him. And Albie said, thank God he didn't. How can someone come up to you and say, I'm sorry I blew off your arm? It's an entirely empty rhetorical conceit. There can be no content to such a performance of remorse. In fact, in the end, the country did decide who it trusted. The country absolutely held on to individuals, some of whom did not get amnesty, and people who had suffered viciously at their hands would say, I felt really sorry for him because I could feel his remorse. So there was a sense, there was a sensibility. But, what are we basing that on? We are dissemblers. It's part of our genius.
Jane, I've always been so struck by exactly the passage you just showed with Dirk, and that some of what's in that is verbatim in the play in Ubu and the Truth Commission at his sort of final sort of moment of confession and dissembling. To what extent is Dirk Coetzee sort of your main model for Pa Ubu? Or is he more of a composite?
So Ubu and the Truth Commission, I don't know how many of you know the play Ubu Roi. There's a kind of a diabolical figure who is a plunderer. He goes around the world just taking whatever he wants and treating anyone any way that he cares to without any sense of the implications of his actions. So he took that Ubu character and put that character into the kind of ethical domain of the hearings from the Truth Commission to try and see what those asymmetries feel and look like. What happens when you have this hypercharged infant stampeding around the world inside the kind of careful and nuanced voices of people applying for testimony. So in the first months of the Truth Commission, the hearings were dominated by the human rights violations hearings, people who had suffered atrocities under apartheid, because the state was waiting for the pressure of the accumulation of information. You can't compel someone to come and ask for amnesty. They have to volunteer. So there was this kind of groundswell of catastrophically damaged and assaulted human beings who started telling their stories. And at a certain point, the information that they're producing is constructing an archive. And people who were implicated in their assaults are suddenly recognizing that the archive is coming closer and closer to them. And so everybody sort of sat around waiting, who's going to be the first person to break the story? So when, my interest in Fault Lines was not about making a set of comments on the process of the Truth Commission. I was interested in deepening and thickening the conversations inside the commission by drawing artists into the process. So I wanted it to be simultaneous with the process. So we don't have hindsight, we didn't have kind of wisdom of looking back at the process and interpreting what the process meant. We were trying to compel people to say, what does the process mean inside the process? So when we started writing that character, only 2 or 3 amnesty applicants had at that stage come forward. And Dirk Coetzee was one of the primary figures inside the narrative precisely because he had triggered the whole cycle of event. He had actually precipitated. I don't know, and I discovered this at a workshop that I put together for journalists covering the commission, was Dirk Coetzee tried to approach the Afrikaans media to tell his story about his role in hit squads, and the Afrikaans media wouldn't touch it. So he went to Max du Preez, the guy that you see running the TV show each week, and asked Max du Preez, can't we do something, because Max was a kind of radical outsider Afrikaner, can't we find a place of tabling my story inside the national arena, because the Afrikaans media are going to kill me before they'll publish anything. And Max du Preez went to the Dutch and said to the Dutch, can you fund an instrument that will publish the story that Dirk Coetzee has to tell? And that's how Vrye Weekblad got invented. A radical Afrikaner newspaper was invented in South Africa in order to carry the story about those hearings. And so, because he was at some stage the initiating voice, he is the primary figure. All of the other, all of the people who applied for or who are involved in the human rights hearings, their testimony is discreet and to the individual. I didn't feel I had any right to manipulate their testimony in any way. But I didn't feel quite the same obligation to integrity in relation to the assassins. So the assassins are a kind of a conglomerate. And so Pa Ubu stands in for the event of the killer rather than for any individual. Yeah.
This question might be more appropriate for your May 2nd presentation, but I was wondering whether your thoughts on Reformation, torture, early modernism, late 20th, early 20th, first century. You've done a play, Ubu and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and you said you did the libretto for Kentridge's Zeno, the Confessions of Zeno. Could you just talk a little bit about how your scholarship and your professorship is impacting on your future creative processes? And will there possibly be a collaboration with Kentridge, completing a trilogy of works on either South Africa, or just in the last couple of months we've seen Russian soldiers in eastern Ukraine boasting that they killed 15 imprisoned Ukrainian prisoners. And are you attempting to bring current incidents into your creativity?
I'm thrilled to have that question, because one of the uncanny things that happened when I got here was to discover that Tartuffe was on. And I have in the last 6 months been saying to Kentridge and to Handspring, maybe we should do a Tartuffe, because we've got into such a kind of shameless moment in which anything like the ambiguity around one's sense of implicatedness. There's something scandalous and riotous in our pleasure at our capacity for pernicious behavior. So, I think that there is something, yet to be explored in the figure of the Tartuffe. So that is something I'm really interested in. And I am also interested in the puzzle of how one works creatively in one domain and works with a kind of a scholarly project on the other hand. I'm interested in that as a kind of vexed question, because I know the Academy has an uneasy relationship to the creative process as scholarship. So I'm always trying to push the sort of frontier of the relationship between those two.
But
Thank you.
No Titus, you have no idea, no thoughts about doing a Titus Andronicus?
Well, it's a kind of, I think the play is completely thrilling, and I think it's underexplored, and I think the complexities of Aaron are underexplored. I'm really, really interested in that character. So thank you for the provocation.
Maybe one more question and we'll let you rest.
Oh, good.
I think it was one back there.
There's one here.
Very thought-provoking presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
So many things came up. Of course, we'll put this question about the psychoanalytic understanding of psychopathic personality, put that aside. But I immediately was thinking of the trial of Adolf Eichmann as depicted by Hannah Arendt, and I'm not sure if you examined that. And then more practically, I'm thinking of the young mothers who have mischievous sons and who are telling, now Paul apologized to Sarah for what you just did. So I wonder how will mothers raise their children
I think that the invention of a moral order, it's something we've failed to do somehow. This generation seems to be particularly poor at it. I don't know how one conjures, I think that, I'm a South African girl. I grew up with a very animate universe, so I was always in a world which was thick with different orders of living things. So I think that one of the things that we've done is we've created environmental deserts around us, so one's not being held by a complex ecology. So I think that it's much easier to be a narcissistic self, because we're all, obviously given political difference and all of the complexity that is inside the plateau that we've created. Nonetheless, I think one lives in a much less complex relation to orders of life. And I think that we've stripped away our capacity for sympathetic imagination in a lot of spheres. And we also live in realms that are self-replicating. So the complexity of the world has diminished. So I think that that's, a really, really profound lack in the mode in which one inculcates a moral universe. But it's a real disquiet for me. Eichmann, is I think it is an astonishingly interesting case study. I had, in a kind of hypothetical way, thought that I might talk about Eichmann here, but so many different purposes came, because once I knew I had a Hobbes scholar in the room, I had to think about Hobbes. So sorry. Hard to imagine where that kind of failure happens. And several times one heard in South Africa the articulation of "I was doing my job." But generally in South Africa, that was attached to anerotics. There was a very, and interestingly, you talked about the pathological. I was asked a very provocative question the first time I spoke about the play publicly. Someone said to me, and it was a really threatening question at the time, the South African state was an inordinately rational, modernist instrument for the extraction of profit. Why do you locate that state inside the figure of Ubu? And I sort of thought I'd been punched a mortal blow for a couple of seconds, but then I realized, and I actually do believe the answer, that ordered rational state attaches itself to catastrophe. It attaches itself to pathology. It needs the Rottweiler. It creates conditions of the reproduction of damage in order to have people who will deploy its ends. Its ends may be distilled and economic, but it needs people who will treat one another like instruments. And that's where the degradation of the human subject happens, when the human subject is cajoled to treat another human subject like an instrument. Thanks. There was one question here, and you did ask early. He did ask early.
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe a little irrelevant, but what was your take on the Oscar Pistorius testimony in terms of sincerity?
I'm going to tell a kind of naughty joke first. And the naughty joke is someone I heard recently now. What was the damn context? Someone was talking about, it's the outrageous, really, really rude, funny man, Craig Ferguson. I was watching on the plane. And he told the story about having met a war vet from Afghanistan who'd lost both of his lower limbs. And he said to him, this must be completely catastrophic for you. How are you coping with this? And the vet said, and it's obviously, in the way the smile that we see is such an alienating effect in Dirk. The vet said, "You've got to be kidding. I came in here 5'8", I'm leaving 6'2". So the Oscar Pistorius phenomenon, South Africa is, the one thing that we do have in common across race, across class, across economic difference, patriarchy, is an absolutely intractable violence inside the country. And so the women's movement has been phenomenal, and the work at trying to reconstitute parity. So I think that he was a wretched figure in a wretched circumstance, and he was betrayed by parents who wanted to bolster him, but who thought that the father thought he could bolster him by giving him a gun. So I think that there are all sorts of ways in which the catastrophe of the American relation to the gun and the South African relation to the gun, catastrophe of the relation between men and women, these orders of being are not so remote from one another, and we recognize who becomes the victim on the streets. So, I feel wretched about him, but I can't imagine that he wasn't implicated. Okay, thanks so much.